Hello and welcome to another edition of Tales from Europe, a show which takes a Eurocentric look at geopolitics. This week we'll be continuing our series of background investigations into the nature of Britain and the EU, looking at major events and ideologies which have shaped the Europe we live in today. Before we get into today's topic, I'd just like to take a moment to say that if you wish to support this podcast and talknetwork.com, you might consider taking a look at some of the excellent natural news health products which you can find on the website hannah.talknetwork.com. That's hannah.talknetwork.com, and that's Hannah, Hannah. Now, in the last podcast, we looked at Nazi ideology and the financial continuity of the Third Reich. In the next show, we'll be looking at the Bilderberg Group, their influence on European unity, transatlantic trade, and the big changes taking place right now within their steering committee. This week, however, we'll be exploring what Peter Dale Scott calls a structural deep event, or an SDE, an event which has a massive impact on the psyche of society. Peter Dale Scott suggests, and here I'm quoting him, a dark force behind these events, which he calls a deep state, operating both within and outside the public state. He goes on to say that these are the kind of events which violate the social structure. I think structural deep event is a wonderful term for these confusing and shocking events which facilitate and accelerate great social, political and geopolitical change. The structural deep event we'll be talking about today is the terrorist attack which took place in London on July the 7th, 2005. The findings of the Metropolitan Police investigation are basically that 4 young men made explosives after looking up recipes on the internet and detonated the bombs in a suicidal act of jihad. A piece of legislation called the Terrorism Act of April 2006 was a direct consequence of the attacks and allowed terrorism suspects to be held without charge for 28 days, an increase of 14. That legislation was followed by measures that allowed the Bank of England to freeze the assets of terrorism suspects. However, the public has not yet seen any evidence which would convict the alleged bombers in a court of law. The fact that the alleged bombers are now apparently dead means that it is not seen as necessary to prove their guilt. Their guilt has simply been assumed by the Metropolitan Police, the government and the media. Given the scale of the atrocity, it's odd that Tony Blair said at the time that an independent inquiry into the attacks would not only be a ludicrous diversion, but would also undermine support for MI5. However, David Cameron, on the 2nd of May 2007, said that only a full inquiry would get to the truth of what happened, although he seems to have gone a bit quieter on the subject now since becoming Prime Minister. 10 years on and we have no sign of an inquiry, and the anomalies and holes in the official story remain. I'm now going to be talking about some of these anomalies with journalist, broadcaster and researcher Tony Gosling, who has recently written a piece pulling together many of the inconsistencies associated with the attacks. You can find the piece on washingtonsblog.com and it's called 7/7 led to wars abroad and loss of freedoms at home. But do we know what really happened that day? So Tony, hello.
Hi Hannah.
What were your initial thoughts when you first saw the 7/7 narrative take shape? Did you notice anything inconsistent in the news reports? I know that one of the points you raise concerns the movements of Benjamin Netanyahu on the day of the attacks.
There were various stories. I mean, this is literally the day after I was checking through these, and different stories about what his movements had been on that morning. Some were saying he stayed in his hotel, others saying he was on his way to a conference at Liverpool Street Station, and then he got a warning and so went back to his hotel. And others even saying that he was just leaving the hotel. Something you got, okay, I mean, there are, when you've got 3 different versions of events, you've got to start really looking hard to see what's going on there. And the report I've ever since that day really focused on is this one from Amy Tiebel at Associated Press in Jerusalem.
So what did she find out?
She phoned up from Associated Press, phoned up the Israeli embassy in London because she realised pretty quickly that one of the 4 London bombs was at Liverpool Street Station, where Benjamin Netanyahu, who was the finance minister at the time of Israel, was meant to be that day. So she got straight onto the Israeli embassy and said, "Is Bibi all right?" And that was Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
And she got a reply from the Israeli embassy, from an anonymous source at the embassy, saying he changed his plans due to a warning and he didn't leave his hotel. So he didn't go to the conference, so everything's fine. The only problem is, of course, it was supposed to be a surprise attack. And I've since learned through David Pratt and others, he's the foreign affairs editor up at the Sunday Herald in Scotland, that Dan Sheham is the unnamed source. He was the Israeli spokesperson at the embassy that morning. And that the Israeli embassy actually about 7 a.m. that day went on to high security alert, basically a lockdown situation, because they had got an alert that there may be a bomb attack in London that day.
Now, Tony, was that ever reported in the Sunday Herald, or was that just told to the journalists?
I'm not sure about whether that's still available. I know David Pratt reported it, but I mean, this is all really important stuff. If you're going to have a surprise attack and there's a warning at 7 a.m. when the bombs went off round about 9,
it could have been
someone's
stopped,
had 2 hours. Yeah, and in Amy Tiebel's report, she says that the Scotland Yard had given the Israeli embassy a warning. That's what they said. They got a warning from Scotland Yard. So the denials since have been, first of all, from Scotland Yard. That was immediate, literally on the day. Scotland Yard said, "No, we never gave any warning to the Israeli embassy," and then since that, the Israeli embassy have denied the story completely, saying that we didn't get any warning. So there's been lots of denial.
Did Amy Tiebel's piece go out at all? It was Associated Press. Was it picked
was all
up
over
by any other media?
Well, it was, and also questions were put to Scotland Yard immediately about whether there was a warning by the London press, and that's when they immediately that day were denying that there'd been any warning. So either there's a 2-hour warning or there's no warning. So that for me is a really serious thing that needs explaining. It's not good enough just for somebody, another anonymous person from the Israeli embassy or Israeli government, just to say, well, sorry, we got it wrong. There was no warning, because I mean, Bibi was supposed to be out and about and he wasn't. So there must have been a reason for it. So that was one of the, I think really, for me, literally the day after the 7/7 attacks, I'm suddenly looking at this thinking, well, this just doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, so perhaps this is our smoking gun. But another gun which seems to be smoking away is that the Overland Train that the bombers were meant to have caught into London that morning, the train that the police investigation told us they had caught, had actually been cancelled. This was a train from Luton, right?
That's right, the one from Luton down to King's Cross. Well, look, I mean, a lot of people will say, well, the police just got it wrong, that if they thought it was that train, it wasn't that train. I would suggest there's two aspects to this. First of all, it makes it very difficult for the alleged bombers to be in the right place. If they haven't got that train, then they got the train after and it was late, so there are questions about whether people can actually be in the right place at the right time to set bombs off. All I'm saying is there are questions about that. I think that I don't have the resources to go into all of it, but it certainly looks as if that they may not be able to have actually been where they said they were, where the official narrative says they were. But also, I think in a way, more importantly, what it shows is the, should we say, cursory nature of this police inquiry into what happened. That they can, police can actually just get a train wrong. I didn't get a train, they got another train. I mean, surely, if the Met had been down King's Cross asking staff, etc., which train did they go on or whatever, they've been looking through CCTV, etc., they would have pinned down a specific train journey and a specific train, and also maybe interviewed people who were on that train who would be able to tell you whether they were acting suspiciously, this sort of thing. We're all told, aren't we, on the underground constantly, if you see anything suspicious, please tell a member of staff. But it just showed really that
it was a very sloppy investigation by the police.
I think what happened is a narrative had been drawn up before the investigation had been done.
And you mentioned CCTV, but actually that's another of your key points, is despite hundreds of cameras, there are actually no images that we've seen or that have been released of any of the 4 alleged bombers getting onto the tubes or buses.
That's right. I don't know if you remember the killing of the Brazilian electrician João Charles de Menezes on Channel 4 News when the inquest opened into that killing. Jon Snow and the Channel 4 news people actually went out and about on the underground system just to see how many CCTV, because there were no pictures of him at all, and to literally count the number of cameras that had been pointing at them as they went down onto the underground, a couple of stops along and up again. They counted over 100 cameras altogether that could or should have picked them up at one point or another. And this is a really important, I think, that what happened apparently after the 7/7 bombings is that detectives had been round to collect tapes from the London Underground staff of these CCTV cameras, and then had basically taken possession of them, and that was the last that many people saw of anything, rather like some of these other attacks.
So there wasn't supposedly a failure of the system.
The tapes were collected, as I understand it, by the detectives from the Met, and then
swallowed up, never seen again.
Only a few bits and pieces have been released. So, of course, we don't have the complete evidence. We may even see some of these alleged bombers in places where they were not supposed to be on those tapes. But we've no idea because the police have completely taken control of all of the evidence. Now, that's okay. You would understand that in a Crown prosecution if the police were trusted. But the Metropolitan Police have got a whole history of problems. There's that wonderful book Untouchables by the two Guardian journalists, or at least at one point or another they were working for the Guardian, about the Metropolitan Police corruption. Deep-rooted corruption. And even Sir Paul Condon, the former Chief Constable, said that there are hundreds of corrupt detectives and there's nothing I can do about it because they've got fantastic lawyers. Now, with that background and all that CCTV footage being in their hands, then can we really trust that we've got a full picture from them? Well, of course we can't.
At least if we had some CCTV footage released, we'd be able to elucidate what train they were on.
Well, there have been some CCTV pictures released, but none that actually put them where they're supposed to be, literally anywhere close to the time. So none where they're getting onto the trains that blew up. There's nothing from the trains themselves. There's nothing from the bus, for example. So nothing. Whereas you would expect at least something. It's rather like the crash of Diana's Mercedes in the Alma Tunnel in Paris in the 90s. Suddenly no CCTV cameras everywhere, but no pictures from them. So,
and if you haven't seen it already, Unlawful Killing, which is produced by Keith Allen, is an amazing documentary about the death of Princess Diana. There's no way you can watch it and continue to believe that her death was an accident. And indeed, the whole point of the film is that the inquest into her death actually did fix on a verdict of unlawful killing. I believe it's available on YouTube now, although it was very hard to find for quite a while. So I do recommend that you take a look at it if you haven't seen it, in case it disappears again.
I think, we're into this territory where if the state in some way is involved in these terrorist attacks, then the state doesn't wish to convict itself. So, people who are actually doing the investigation probably should be being investigated themselves.
There does seem to be a pattern of failure when it comes to CCTV, when you get these very sensitive events.
We know from past experience, from some other attacks in other parts of the world, where there has definitely been different forms of police security service complicity, and if one arm of the Securocrat state is involved in the actual attack, then you would expect to find evidence going missing, and that's what we see with the CCTV footage on and images on 7/7.
Well, Tony, another question you raise about the sequence of events on 7/7 concerns the terror drills that were actually taking place that morning at the very same tube stations. Now, the person running these drills, Peter Power, apparently described this as a spooky coincidence, didn't he?
I did a back-of-an-envelope calculation as to whether Peter Power is telling the truth about his terror drills. He's actually, he said a spooky coincidence on Canadian television, not on our television. Although, of course, he was all on several outlets talking about this. He's a former detective from Dorset Police that set up a sort of consultancy firm, and he's reeled out almost very regularly on the television to talk about these sorts of this. It wasn't surprising that he was on the telly that day. What was surprising was this thing that he was saying. Well, he was the terror drills he was running were on the same day and at the same 3 tube stations. Well, on a back-of-the-envelope calculation, that's around about an 8 billion to 1 chance. There's 270-something stations that it could have been at, but it just happened to be at the same one. So I think it's fairly clear that Peter Power may well be lying about this, and I don't know if he's been asked about it. But one of the more interesting things that came out, another interesting thing that came out of this terror drill, is he would not say who'd commissioned it until he actually wrote on one of the blogs that he does about 2 or 3 years after the attacks that these exercises have been commissioned by Reed Elsevier publishers. And I just looked into Reed Elsevier to find that, oh gosh, these are the guys that organised the big London Arms Fair in Docklands up until a few years ago. So he's dealing with a company which is a publisher of and event organiser for the arms industry.
Sorry, Tony, if we can back up a moment, I don't understand how publishers could commission a terror drill. Surely that would be for the government or the Metropolitan Police to commission.
Isn't this one of the problems we're in nowadays, is that a lot of kind of private companies doing this private security work? I mean, look.
It could be a subcontract.
You could go all the way up to Blackwater. Blackwater took it off their website, but a few years ago they were actually advertising on their website that they can fight nuclear wars for you. And, this is, I mean, obviously they're going to be paid a lot to do that. But as we outsource more and more and more from our government to private industry, this is one of the problems that we come up against, is that these private firms may be getting paid by more than one source. So they might be doing a job for one country, whereas actually part of doing that job is being paid by another country to spy on that first country. So, there is the sort of blurred lines now between whether there's any kind of real national security involved in these tests or not. And I mean, there's a lot of people in the military too who are very concerned about the idea of privatising this kind of thing.
And these drills were simulating bomb attacks, or there are other ones going on as well?
Well, according to Peter Power, they were a sort of kind of whiteboard exercise, and there were various people in the room, who were going through this stuff. But I mean, I think there's been various versions of stories about.
I mean, does the Metropolitan Police report mention the drills?
Not as far as I know. No, the official narrative I don't think mentions them. If only possibly to dismiss them. But I mean, most of the reports I've read since 7/7 have simply said, well, this is just a coincidence. Well, it's a spooky coincidence, as he says.
Yeah, right. And he doesn't talk about that anymore, does he? I think people have questioned him subsequently.
No. And I mean, the significance here is that quite often with these false flag terrorist attacks, you've got real drills going on, which in a way paralyse the emergency services and the forces that should, other emergency services that should react to something.
And create a lot of confusion.
They're tied up with a silly drill, which has got, and there's a lot of confusion spreads because people who are involved in the drill think that what they're being told is part of a drill, but it's not. It's a real attack. So there seems to be there's quite a movement, actually. I'm not sure if you've come across these Teammate Plus people in the States, but they are constantly scanning the world for terrorist drills to sort of warn people, well, hang on, there's a terrorist drill coming up in your city.
Yeah, you don't want to be there when they're running a terrorist drill.
Get out of the way, yeah. Yeah, it's a good way if you want to paralyse the emergency services and paralyse everybody that should deal with a terrorist attack, is to tie them up with a drill.
So this group is called Teammate.
Teammate Plus in the States. I know I don't know if they're still doing that, but they certainly for a long time. I used to get emails off them saying terrorist drill in Vancouver in 2 weeks' time.
Okay, Tony, what about the nature of the explosions themselves? Because I believe that one of your key points is that they appeared to be military-grade explosives. Was it Christophe Chaboud, a French anti-terrorism expert, analysed these kind of explosions?
Well, I mean, he was attached to the French embassy in London, and he volunteered his services. He was phoning up the press, basically, on 7/7 the day after, saying, look, I'm an explosives expert. Do you want to talk to me about the bombs you just had? and eventually some of the channels and radio, etc., and newspapers said yes. And he made it absolutely clear that he believed that the power of these explosions were, and he'd seen some of the images from the, twisted bits of metal, etc., were almost certainly C4 military explosives, that sort of thing, the sort of Semtex style high explosive, rather than this homemade TATP. Now, I mean, I'm not an explosive expert myself, and I couldn't tell you, but there are certainly, it does seem that the impact of the explosives was really devastating in localised area.
Massive. Yeah.
I mean, there are other aspects to, particularly the tube bombs, in that Mark Honigsbaum at The Guardian said that in his first audio report, having just spoken to people coming out of the King's Cross bomb, the Edgware Road bomb, that the people had been telling him as they came out that the bombs were underneath the trains, not in the trains. Now, that obviously could be just a mistake, but there is other corroborating evidence for that, and that is that a lot of the debris from the smashed windows of the trains was found inside the trains rather than outside, which suggests maybe the explosion was outside the train rather than in. And also, also that the trains were lifted up off the track and derailed, and one of the trains anyway went into the path of another oncoming train.
Right.
So that does. That suggests that the bomb is underneath. But anyway, very powerful explosives, and this is an explosives expert saying that this is not homemade explosive, this is military grade.
Right. And then a bus in Tavistock Square. The
bus bomb was about an hour after the tube bombs. So many of us think, it was simultaneous, but it wasn't. The three tubes were,
I thought it was.
all three, around about 9 in the morning. And then an hour later or so, there's the number 30 bus, the bomb on the upstairs deck of that. Blew up about an hour later, around about 10, 5 to 10, something like that, in Tavistock Square.
And another of your questions concerning the events of 7/7 involves a witness on the bus whose testimony contradicts the official story, doesn't it?
Well, that's Daniel Obachicky. He wrote the book, The Fourth Bomb, and he's a tall guy. I met him a couple of times, and he says he was on the bus. And I did actually cross-examine him, and you can find the interview on online, various places, and it's called the Peter Power Terror Drill Inquest. That was actually Daniel's title for it, because he wanted to do an inquest into that, an investigation. He says that basically this guy he got onto the bus while Daniel was on there, and he said he immediately noticed him because he looked nervous, and then he sat downstairs, and then he got up again with his rucksack on and went upstairs, and then he was the last person to get off the bus before it blew up. But I mean, I can't verify Daniel. No, all I can say is
that's his story. Yeah,
this is just one of so many anomalies that I've come across.
You're listening to Tales from Europe. I'm Hannah Borno, and I'm here with journalist and broadcaster Tony Gosling discussing the 7/7 London bombings that took place in 2005. Now, the number 30 bus in Tavistock Square is where 13 people of the 52 victims died, although of course more than 700 people were injured in the attacks overall. Anyway, I just want to quickly run through another couple of points that you mention in the piece. So it was this rather strange, mysterious figure, this former Royal Navy Special Forces guy, Martin McDade, who was a supposed Muslim convert. Now, what was he doing up in Cumbria with two of the alleged bombers prior to the bombings?
Well, it's a great question, isn't it? And I mean, very few people have done this business of rewinding 2 years before the bombings, going back to 2002 and 2003, up to Beeston, to Leeds, to the Iqra bookshop in Beeston, where Mohammed Sadiq Khan and Shahzad Tanweer were working, amongst other things that they were doing in the community. They were very much involved in this kind of radical Islamic bookshop. And there were several figures also in that bookshop. One of the most interesting is this guy you mentioned, Martin McDade, former Special Boat Service, which for people that don't know, that's basically the Royal Navy's version of the SAS, special forces used for black ops, all sorts of dirty tricks. And he has decided he's had enough of working for them, and he's going to convert to Islam and go and sit down and chat and work with and train in military tactics these two alleged bombers from 2 years later. There's very little work's been done on this. Of course, the inquest did cover it to a certain extent. He was taking Khan and Tanweer over to Cumbria to do terrorist training, and that's all documented. Just literally recently, more evidence has come out about Harun Aswat as well, who'd been meeting with the alleged bombers in the run-up to the 7/7 attacks, but focusing back on the Iqra bookshop in Beeston in Leeds. There was also Martin Gilbertson, who was fixing computers in the bookshop back in 2003. And he was in this sort of milieu with these, this ex-special forces guy and the two London bombing suspects. And he actually started to collect, because he was worried about these people. He said, well, look, we've got a potential little terror cell here, particularly with the person he seemed to be most worried about was this guy Martin McDade, who was actually a British Special Forces guy in there. And he took a whole dossier of evidence, plus some of his own.
So this was just another guy that worked in the bookshop?
He's actually an anti-war activist, peace activist. And Martin Gilbertson gave one of the most fascinating bits of testimony at the inquest into the 7/7 bombings. And he'd taken to West Yorkshire Police a whole dossier of evidence that he'd put together himself about these people, saying, look, you've got to watch out for this lot. Something dangerous is brewing here. Now, he took it into a police station and wanted to hand it over, but they said no. Best thing to do is to make some copies of it and send them in to various departments in West Yorkshire Police, to CID, etc., which is what he did. And maybe special branch. I'm not sure exactly who he sent it to, but various people. Anyway, Martin was pretty shocked when he saw that these people, when it came to 2005, had been involved in this. So he went straight back to the police and said, I told you. And they said, well, actually, they said, we have no record of you sending us anything. There are all sorts of peculiar things around this, and it almost looks as if the information that he gathered on these people and sent in may even have been used as a sort of recruiting tool by somebody. If the police have denied that he's even given them this information, and that he's testified on oath at the inquest that he has done, what happened there? So, this does seem to me to be a completely unlooked at aspect of the
very much
the bombings. And certainly, I went in 2006. I actually travelled up to Leeds and had some people wouldn't have liked me doing it, but I did it anyway, which is just going around knocking on doors in the area around Beeston.
So real proper journalism, Tony. Actually knocking on doors. One thing I found universally up there was that nobody in Beeston believed that they'd done it. So very few people, anyway. People in the shops said, "Oh yes, I knew him. He used to come in here, etc." But he didn't do it. But that was just the lingua franca on the streets of Beeston, that these people hadn't actually been involved. Now, they haven't been asked to testify at inquest. Anyway, this is just conjecture, but that's what I found on the streets back in 2006. Obviously this is, as you say, conjecture and speculation. So was the thought that they may have just been patsies?
Well, it's not impossible. I think the looking at it now, it seems that they may have been brought to London on some other pretext. One of the most important characters in all of this is this guy Harun Aswat, who's known to...
Yes, you mentioned him. Who's he?
Well, he was Abu Hamza's right-hand man at Finsbury Park Mosque. Abu Hamza was the famous guy with the hook.
Yeah.
And actually, other people in the mosque had contacted the Metropolitan Police in early 2000s, saying, please, will you get these people out of our mosque? And they said, actually, no, we want to keep an eye on them, so we'd rather they stayed there for the time being. And they were wanting to get Abu Hamza out, basically. This is Al-Majroon, the group Al-Majroon. And Harun Aswat was one of the two key people, him and Harun Aswat, in that group. And he'd been contacting the 7/7 people in the run-up to it. Now, I mentioned him earlier because he has just finally been sentenced in the United States for a completely different bunch of alleged things he's supposed to have done, trying to set up a terrorist training camp in Oregon. And as part of that trial, one of the things that came out was that he met, not only was he making phone calls in the run-up to the 7/7 bombings, but he met the two of the bombers, Khan and Tanweer, apparently, over in Pakistan too. So these three were like that, And John Loftus, the former FBI special investigator who was appointed by Jimmy Carter to do things like investigate Nazis, and he had access to all the security files of the States. He's written a lot of books about these sorts of security affairs. He named Haroun Aswat as what he believed was an MI6 double agent. But the problem, of course, is that Haroun Aswat is now out of Britain. Even if the families wanted to launch have lost their loved ones, wanted to launch a private prosecution against him, they can't. He's out of Britain's legal jurisdiction. He was in Broadmoor for years because he was supposed to have paranoid schizophrenia. Well, I wonder whether maybe he was actually just trying to tell the truth, and this whole idea of paranoid schizophrenia was saying, well, no, you were nothing to do with MI5 or MI6.
You're just deluded. Yeah, very effective method of shutting someone up.
But anyway, he's now been taken out of the country. So I think one of the key people that needs to be interviewed about 7/7, and I'm quite no doubt have lots of interesting things to say about it all, is Aswat.
Very interesting. So just to recap, these anomalies have been drawn together by Tony in the article 7/7 led to wars abroad and loss of freedoms at home, but do we know what really happened that day? And you can find that on washingtonsblog.com. And Tony and Martin Summers also chat through all this information in a YouTube video which is called 10 Years After 7/7, 13 Holes in the Government and Media Accounts of the 2005 London bombings. Now, Tony, you've had quite a bit of experience in covering terrorist attacks as a journalist, is that right?
I mean, I covered terrorism, the IRA terrorism, in the early 1990s, 90 and 91, for the BBC in London. And it was a very busy newsroom, Marylebone High Street, Greater London Radio. We had James Cameron, a young news editor who was, I would say, a great guy to work with, and not all news editors I've worked with are the same as him. He was really interested. First of all, he had a really good team, and he was able to use this whole thing of force multiplication on a story where you'd put 3 or 4 reporters sometimes if it was an important breaking story, and he'd really tease the coverage out, really before any of the competition. And of course, we were in a way in competition with network radio, network television as well. So, and he would actually see other parts of the BBC as the competition as well. So we were almost like hunting like a pack, in a way, to get stories. And of course, most of the stories are boring press releases, but these bomb attacks really were, it was a question of getting the facts out to the public as soon as we could. And obviously, with that sort of story, you've got to also make sure your facts are correct.
Yes, with so many conflicting stories, it requires careful research and critical thinking to work your way through the evidence, the reports and the statements. And it's worth remembering that the then Shadow Home Secretary David Davis said, and I quote, "It is becoming more and more clear that the story presented to the public and Parliament is at odds with the facts." So, Tony, I wonder if you could say a few words now about the official investigations into the events on 7/7. There was an inquest into the deaths which I believe was held 5 years after the attacks took place.
Well, looking at the judicial process, Lady Justice Hallett, in the inquest which opened in 2010, there was lots and lots of problems with this. First of all, an inquest is for a single death. Well, we had 56 people dead. And yet, so that really isn't suitable. An inquest is not suitable to look into those deaths.
So what do you
What is suitable and is designed for it is a public inquiry.
And we still haven't had a public inquiry into the 7/7 bombings.
That's right. And actually the families of the victims are not at all happy with the way that inquest went, because they weren't allowed legal representation in the inquests, and also they weren't allowed to ask questions, which they wanted to ask, obviously. They wanted to have
so they just had an inquest. This is dreadful, I don't know this. They just had an inquest into the deaths of all those people.
Yeah, but you see, the inquest is run by the Crown, and the Crown runs everything. So they weren't actually given the opportunity to ask questions. And, this is one of the things I found so horrifying about and shocking about this, is listening to the voices of the families of people who lost their loved ones saying, we were not listened to, we were stonewalled. There are several people who are very open and very, very vocal about this, who lost their loved ones, basically saying that they want an independent. They're not interested in having a public inquiry, which is run in any way by the government, because the Inquiries Act puts ministers in charge of these inquiries. They don't want that. They want an independent inquiry, something along the lines of the Hillsborough inquiry, which is actually run and managed by the families of the victims.
So we have all these calls for a new inquiry into the attacks on 9/11, but we also have a less vocal calls for a new inquiry into the 7/7 bombings.
That's right. The other thing about the inquest is that Lady Justice Hallett decided to hold it without a jury. Now, this is this to me is a big red flag over the whole judicial process. If you don't have a jury, you don't have justice.
Yeah. And yet, in spite of all this information that is out there and that you've pulled together, British researchers and the alternative media in the UK tend to be more focused on picking holes in the official narrative of the US terror attacks of 2001, rather than focusing on the 2005 attacks, which took place in central London. The 7/7 bombings attacked the very heart and soul of London, kept us in lockstep with US foreign policy, and also gave grounds for the Domestic Terrorism Act, which was passed in April 2006. So surely we should be looking closer to home. Why do you think we in the UK continue to focus on the US and 9/11?
Well, it's a great question, because I think one of the reasons is, first of all, that the 9/11 attacks were big and actually I think a little bit less complicated than the 7/7 attacks. In a way, I think after the 9/11 attack, there's some very obvious problems with the 9/11 attacks, like the collapse of Building 7, like the fact that the US air defences didn't do anything to stop these jets which were flying around with hijacked planes. They didn't even bother to try and intercept them or fly alongside them. There are lots and lots of, very obvious big problems with the 9/11 attacks. Also, of course, 9/11 was the opening shot, really, in the New American Century, PNAC, the war on terror, this kind of, that whole business. So I think maybe people have sort of not focused so much on how important it was to get the Britain behind this war on terror and to make the terror real in London. Very important thing to do. And I think it was actually quite a more sophisticated operation. Someone had put more time and effort into trying to make sure that it wasn't going to be possible to untangle it.
The anomalies, so maybe, as you say, the anomalies and the holes in that story weren't as immediately obvious.
Well, the horrifying thing about this is that the people that perpetrate these types of attacks do look quite closely at the way that people critique them afterwards, to think, well, actually, and they try and learn from this to make the next attack that they do more difficult to critique. So
to finesse their modus operandi.
Absolutely right. So I think that's one of the reasons why the 7/7 went on. Also, of course, it might be fair to say that Britain was a little bit more critical and a bit more democratic. The US is actually, from Washington, I think, controlled pretty robustly by the US military-industrial complex, whereas Britain is a little bit more wriggle room, and so there needed to be a much more sophisticated attack on London in order to convince people that Islamic terrorism was real and that we really had to do something about it. And of course, it couldn't possibly be the British security services and British arms companies involved in carrying out those attacks.
Well, Tony, you've done a brilliant job bringing together some of these anomalies and putting them together so we can see it as a collective whole. And I just wanted, you and I were talking earlier, and you were saying that you felt almost that the time was right for another false flag.
Yeah, if you go back to the Project for a New American Century, they were making it very clear in there that the expansion of the US empire was going to take quite a long time, except if there was a false flag type of event. They actually said a new Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Now, you can see what's going on here is that these empires, these financial, economic, political, military empires, they love expanding. I mean, this is what they do. In fact, if you go back to medieval times, this is what they did. The summer was the time where the various empires around Europe, around the world, would go out on their horses and start warring and try and grab resources, territory, that sort of thing. And I think that's still the same today. We haven't come on much from that, I'm afraid.
No.
But this attempt to sort of push forward all the time is been taking place in particularly in Eastern Europe, with lots of Eastern European countries really going over to the IMF, coming friendly with the EU, joining NATO, this kind of thing. You've also seen in the Middle East the rolling over of many long-standing regimes like the Libyan regime, the Iraqi regime, in order to give.
So it's all going at full pelt then, Tony. Maybe they don't need one.
The thing is, it hasn't. Recently, it has been blocked. There's been this brick wall come up, mainly from the Russians and Putin, and they have said basically you're not coming any further. Now, Iran and Syria were two countries on the list read out by Wesley Clark. 7 countries in 5 years. And those he's not got those 7 countries in 5 years, or the Pentagon hasn't, and so they've come to hit a brick wall. Now, this is the sort of point I think where we need to be a bit concerned. Syria, the Russians bringing air power into Syria has really said, well, no, you're not going to topple the regime.
They've said enough's enough. We've
had enough of this.
Yeah, leave it at that. Yeah.
So you've now got US special forces on the ground in Syria.
Yeah.
Which is totally illegal under international law. You're not allowed to, just invade a country without going through the UN, although that seems to be the way they do things nowadays. And then, of course, a similar sort of situation has developed in Eastern Europe, where the West is pushing so hard against these Eastern European countries, banging all the time against, trying to get more and more of them to come over to the Western side, that they're actually starting to be counterproductive. What's going on in the Western central Ukraine is people are starting to think, well, actually, maybe we're better off with the Russians, even though they're our historical empire that's controlled us. We're not happy with the other empire that's trying to take us over. So as they've been blocked by the Chinese in the South China Sea, they've been blocked by the Russians in Syria. They've been blocked in Donetsk and Ukraine by the Russians backing up the locals there. I think this is the sort of time where they're sort of starting to run out of military options.
So if you had to put money on it, it's psychological psyop attack.
Yeah, I think some sort of psychological attack on the West. And, of course, that's the thing, that the 7/7 attacks were really, I think, aimed at the British public and aimed at the Western public. So we have become partly the enemy. I mean, it's like, in the past, the IMF used to impoverish African countries with debt. Now the bankers are impoverishing us with the same techniques that we developed in Africa. Yeah, so I think with the public in the West has now become, the enemy, the victims. We've seen all this surveillance with Edward Snowden, etc. Well, everything that we do is being looked at, and so much of our, internet passwords being spied on, all this sort of thing. So I just think that once the territorially the West hits a brick wall, then it's left with very little other option if he wants to keep involved.
So they just pull the false flag out of the bag and things will go for a few years a bit quicker. Well, let's hope that's not the case.
Yeah, it's just I just think that it's. We don't know where it will take place. All I think is that there is a consolidation of the media going on as well, where there's less and less independent press around. What is being taken over. We're in the situation.
So intuitively, you just think that it just feels right for another push.
Yes,
from their point of view.
The privatisation of Channel 4, which is apparently going ahead now. This is all a signal. I think that our independent press is starting to be very strictly controlled. One of the other things I've discovered, particularly through looking at the 7/7 attack, is the way that journalists often write stuff for a paper. I mean, Mark Honigsbaum said to me on the phone after the 7/7 attacks, because I pointed out that you did this interview the day before where you say on the interview that the bombs were underneath the trains.
Yeah.
Well, in the article that you co-wrote with somebody else that appeared in the paper the next day, you say it was suicide bombers in the trains.
Yeah.
How do you account for that? And he paused for a few seconds and he said, well, all I can say, Tony, is not everything I submit as copy ends up in the next day's newspaper.
Crumbs.
So there is this interference really between what journalists write and submit as copy, and they don't, they might look at an article and see a few words change the next day that can be incredibly significant. So, yeah, I mean, who owns the printing presses? Who owns the transmitters? It's not us journalists.
Sadly, no. So, Tony, that's 7/7. What else is on your radar at the moment?
Just a little tidbit which I picked up last week is this business of. Did you know in the States there's some evidence now that the authorities are using fracking boreholes to shove nuclear waste down them?
Oh, lovely.
Heard that?
No.
I mean, I would have a little Google for it, but I mean, they're really worried because I'm quite close to the anti-Hinckley campaigners and they're saying, good God, we don't want that here.
No.
Because anyway, it's one of those.
Oh, thanks.
I've
That's
not
just a
even heard
cheery
of.
little
I know,
note
well,
to
they're
finish on.
total bastards, aren't they? I mean, they're just nutters, and it's like the mafia. The mafia are always the people. This guy I know in Italy, Charlie, showed me this because he'd done quite a lot of work on the mafia. That if you want to find, he said, if you in Italy, if you want to find the local mafia, just go to your local waste disposal companies, and there they are.
Oh.
I mean, that's I guess what's going on with the nuclear stuff is they're just looking as a because there's a fortune in getting rid of this stuff. If you can get rid of it, then great, we'll pay you a fortune. So
right. So there's big money in waste.
Yeah.
But also, don't you think it could be something else? It could be that if you look at companies like Nestle, that they want the monopoly on clean drinking water. Don't you think that this fracking is just polluting the water tables everywhere? Maybe there's another agenda as well.
Yes, of course. No, I agree. No, I totally totally on to that. Well, I mean, our local water company, Bristol Water, totally evil. They're run by this. It's all privatised. They're run by this company, Capstone Industries, and it's just got this kind of Illuminati symbol.
Oh my God! Yes, the capstone. Oh,
I'll leave you with that lovely thought.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tony. Goodbye.
Hey, Hannah, thanks very much.
Tony, thank you so much. Just to recap, those two books that were mentioned were Untouchables, about huge levels of corruption in the Metropolitan Police, by Guardian journalists Michael Gillard and Laurie Flynn. And the book about one man's experience of being on the number 30 bus, which exploded in Tavistock Square, is called The Fourth Bomb, and that's by Daniel Obachicky. Now, there are quite a few inconsistencies in this book, and it has been quite controversial, but have a look and see what you think of his story anyway. There are lots of online resources looking into these attacks. A really good one is july7th.co.uk. And Tony's piece is on washingtonsblog.com, and it's called 7/7 led to wars abroad and loss of freedoms at home. But do we know what really happened that day? If you want to hear Tony discussing the 7/7 terror attacks with his co-host on This Week, Martin Summers, you can find a great video on YouTube entitled 10 Years After 7/7, 13 Holes in Government and Media Accounts of the 2005 London Bombings. To hear more of their news show, go to thisweek.org.uk. It's looking like we may never know exactly what happened on that Thursday morning on July the 7th, 10 years ago. But it's always good practice to rigorously question the official narratives, especially when the evidence presented to us is so slim and inconsistent. And by the way, it seems there was another important foreign dignitary in London on that day. It was former Mayor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, who was extremely near the blast at Liverpool Street Station that morning, an experience which he described as eerie. Or was it just a spooky coincidence, Mr. Giuliani? So thanks once again to Tony, and thank you for listening. I'm Hannah Borno, and this is Tales from Europe. Until next time, goodbye.